Okay. Okay. Just have to mute the sound here. Fine. Can you see the screen? Good. Okay, so today we have a rather long presentation on the iconography of Christ. Iconography of Jesus is, of course, central for Christian tradition. It's the icon. All the other icons, like of Mary, of the saints, and so on, they are derivative from the main icon of Christ. They are secondary, so to speak. And I hope this was clear in the lecture about iconoclasm, that the absolute basis, the absolute foundation for Christian theology of the icon is the very fact of the incarnation of God. Only because God became human, he can be represented in a painting, and only because God became human, this painting has any religious value of connecting us with the prototype, with God. And therefore, the icon of Christ is the central icon of Christianity, not only because of the obvious reason that Christ is the center of Christianity, but also for this more elaborate theological reason, which I just explained. There are many types of iconography of Christ, but the main ones are four. There are four main types of iconography of Christ that developed through the centuries, starting with early Christian period, but took their final shape in the 9th to the 14th century, in the late post-iconoclastic Byzantine period. And you can see four pretty random presentations of those types. The presentation of the Holy Face, that will be the first and probably most fundamental, although not the most widespread, but one of the most fundamental representations of Christ, and we will see why it has this kind of place of privilege in Christian tradition. The second type is Christ in usually half-figured or sometimes full-figured, with an open or closed book, Christ as a teacher, and this iconography is called Christ the Pantocrator. Pantocrator, I will explain a bit later what it means. And then Christ as a child or as a young boy, Jesus the Emmanuel. So it's the title taken from the Bible, originally from the prophecy of Isaiah 7:14, which says that virgin will conceive and give birth to a child, and the child will be Emmanuel, which is in translation from Hebrew, God with us. Emmanuel means God with us. And then this prophecy is repeated, taken on in the first chapter of Matthew in the New Testament, in the Nativity story pertaining to Jesus. And then final, maybe least familiar for you, is the so-called Christ in the glory, or Christ in the heavenly glory, one could say, representing Jesus also as kind of as a teacher, but in a more heavenly, apocalyptic representation, usually in white, snow white or golden dress, with an open book, but seated not on an ordinary throne, but on a kind of angelic throne, full of angelic faces and wings, You cannot see it really here, but in more detailed representations, we will present that. You will see that more clearly, and that's so. If to put it simply, this is the Christ of incarnation. That is divine logos, divine Word of God, pre-eternal, who became human in this human child. These two ones are Jesus of history, Jesus as he lived and preached on earth in the concreteness of his human face and in main features of his ministry as a preacher, as a teacher, and as a judge. We will see this book has to do with judgment too. And this is the Christ of the eternal kingdom of God and of the second coming. So these four types are most fundamental and most traditional for Eastern Christian iconography. There will be other types too, but they are much less common and much less traditional. They usually emerge, develop in very late Byzantine centuries, like 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, and later are taken on by the Renaissance art, and it becomes a different story. But we want to really focus here on very traditional Byzantine imagery. So today we will cover the following steps in our presentation. We will look at the development of the representations of Christ throughout the history in the first millennium. And we will try to see the logic of this development. How did Christians come to represent Christ in a certain conventional, fixed manner? We will pay special attention to the image of the Holy Face in this development. How did this image contribute to this fixation of certain conventional portrait of Christ? How did it contribute to Christ being recognizable on the presentations? Because he was not so recognizable, there was no unity in various presentations in the early church, and only gradually they developed something that is easily identifiable as portrait of Jesus. This image of the Holy Face, about which we will speak at length later, sometimes is called not made by human hands. It's a kind of awkward English rendering of a very concise Greek word achiropietos, which means not made by human hands. But you just need many words in Greek in English to convey the one synthetic word in Greek. Or sometimes it's referred to as mandilion or cloth image, or the vera icon in Latin, true icon, the true icon, because it's the faithful rendering of the face of Jesus, at least according to the tradition. And then Pantocrator, the Almighty, Emmanuel, and Christ and Glory. I'm afraid we will be able to cover today only Holy Face and Pantocrator. And at the end, please remind me if I forget, I have to make two announcements. One about the next closing lecture, which I'm still willing to do, and I hope you will be happy to attend it. So we will finalize this next time, because for today it's just too much material to cover. We will be going through the Holy Face and Pantocrator only. Here are some presentations of the Holy Face in various from various times, various techniques. The upper two are Ukrainian icons from 15th and 16th century. This is, I think, a 17th century icon, and this is not really classical icon, but kind of later 18th or 19th century, I don't know, Baroque influenced presentation, kind of that. And of course, the difference is that in all traditional Byzantine icons, Jesus is represented as alive and with no connection to the passions, to suffering. And in the Western tradition, this representation on the cloth is tied to the story of Veronica, of a woman who gave this towel to Jesus when he was making the way of the cross, and the imprint that appeared on that towel was, of course, of Jesus' suffering face, and with the crown of thorns. So there are two different traditions, but we'll come to that. Christ the Emmanuel is often used to represent Jesus as a child, often held by Mary, sometimes represented independently, like in this tapestry icon, or here in this fresco, Christ the Emmanuel blessing with two hands as a bishop, as a priest. The Pantocrator images, as I said, they are usually half-figured, like this one, but can be full-figured, standing like this, or seated on a throne. In any case, these are just variations of the type, and the main elements of this type is Jesus in his, say, middle age, or well, in his 30s, as a grown-up man, with beard, with long hair. He is always blessing or pointing to the book, or the blessing is turned to us, and the book can be closed or open. We will see the icons of both types. And Jesus is presented with the cross-shaped halo. Here it's lost, but it was also here. You can see the remnants of the letters. There is an inscription on the halo. I will explain later what it means. So this is just to give you an idea. Holy Face, Emmanuel, Pantocrator, and Christ in glory, enthroned in heaven on the fiery throne, the Old Testament prophets describe, with the living creatures, angels, angelic hosts, and with the four symbols of, again, heavenly powers, and of the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Matthew, John, Mark, and Luke. Okay, but now let us first make this historical overview. How did iconography of Christ develop, and what logic stands behind it? As you remember from our earlier presentations, the earliest Christian representations of Jesus were either symbolic, like completely, the human figure is completely replaced by some meaningful symbol, like the monogram symbol of the hero letters and Alpha and Omega in this case, or kind of symbolic representation of, say, Good Shepherd, one of the most recognizable images of Jesus from the Gospel. Jesus compares himself to the Good Shepherd in John 10, and that becomes one of the favorite Christian representations of Jesus. But you cannot claim that this guy represented here is actually Jesus. No, it's just a conventional representation of a good shepherd that has nothing to do with personal portraitic identity of Jesus. This is simply a symbol of Jesus. The other representations of this symbolic type would be the well-known Lamb of God that occurs many times in the mosaic art, for example, in Ravenna, but also in other places on the sarcophagi and various carvings, stone reliefs, and so on. Again, it's an Old Testament prophetic image of Christ that was fulfilled in the sacrificial death of Jesus on the cross, and that was highly revered by Christians as one of the most important symbols of Jesus. Of course, it has Paschal dimension because Jesus as the Lamb dies on the cross on the Easter Eve, supposedly, and the whole Christian festival of Easter developed around the Old Testament images of Passover meal, Exodus from Egypt, and slaying of the Lamb. But there were also first attempts to represent Jesus personalistically as actual human being, not just as an image of a good shepherd or anything, but Jesus as such, as concrete historical person. But those representations, those attempts were far from historical accuracy. Historical accuracy, like presenting a person as he or she was in real life, was pretty alien to ancient people, and understandably why, because in the culture where you don't have photography, you don't have any way to record how a person actually looked, it was unwise to rely on exact data about someone's appearance. People were often represented symbolically, let's say, based on some oral traditions, or more importantly, on their important features as remembered by the contemporaries. And those features did not necessarily express their physical appearance, but more the meaning of their life, who they were. We probably have some lifetime representations of some emperors, some important military generals, leaders, but those would be rather exceptional. We don't know if we have, actually it's rather unlikely if we have real representations of, say, Socrates or Plato or even Alexander the Great. His historians say that his representations as we have them are probably more fantasy of later artists, later meaning a century or two later after his death, and probably are not his exact portraits. With Jesus, it was the same. We don't possess, as you know, in the Gospels, there are no exact. Actually, there are no any attempts to present the description of his physical appearance, but there were some early Christian legends that circulated around, and they reported the appearance of Jesus, but in a rather general terms, simply saying, outlining his outlook very generally, and I will come to those when we see some early Christian images based on those literary descriptions. But most of the early Christian images had no connection with Jesus' actual look whatsoever, and the brightest example of that is so-called Roman type of representation of Jesus that comes from Roman catacombs, and some other examples of Western art, let's say, of art that developed in Italy, in Rome, and even more westward, like this representation you have seen before. It comes from the 4th century Great Britain. What unites all those images in the so-called Roman type is that they're representing Jesus as an average, kind of stereotypical upper-class Roman man, decently dressed, well shaved, with no beard, or sometimes with a very short beard on the, just like little short hair, and basically that's it. Later it gets this representation that doesn't suggest that it is Jesus even. If you don't know the gospel story of Jesus meeting the Samaritan woman, and you don't know that it was created by Christians, and then you connect the gospel story with the Christian identity of the image, only then you can presume it's Jesus, but there is nothing that would directly bring us to this conclusion. In this case, the hero sign, which you have seen here, becomes an identifier for the personality of Jesus here. So, again, visually, there is nothing we would think of this man as Jesus Christ if it were not for this hero sign over his head, and then other symbolism is included into that. But we see that this diversity of images in early Christianity with the time comes to be perceived as something that has to be dealt with, some problem. The tradition starts to search for a common, recognizable image of Jesus, and the kind of rule, logical principle behind that is that one Christ requires one visual representation, one Christ, one image, so that a person who travels, comes to another city, another church, could immediately recognize that here represented is Jesus Christ. So there are two ways to ensure that. First is to come up with a set of symbols that would accompany the personalistic representation and identify this human figure as Jesus Christ. For example, if this abstract representation of a Roman man would be inscribed with the name Jesus Christos, ISXS, then that would be, again, at least for people who know Christian religion, would be unmistakable identifier of this person with Jesus. Or, for example, if this person would be given a halo with the cross, or like here, the hero sign on over the head, then it becomes an identifier. So the set of symbols, the set of attributes that helps us to identify this person as Jesus Christ is one way to ensure one image for Christ. But the other way is to actually try to work on the face of Jesus so that it becomes recognizable. And since they did not have one prototype, like real historical representation of Jesus as he actually looked in his earthly life, they had to come up with one. There was no historical basis for one representation, so Christian artists, Christian theologians started to create certain common language of Christian iconography, and we will see how it developed over several centuries till it actually reached the point of convergence, where all those diverse images were kind of united into one recognizable image of Christ. It was on the one hand a natural evolution, but it was also, on the other hand, aided by some, one might say, miraculous event, miraculous revelation of an image that helped to establish the canonical standard iconography of Jesus for the centuries and millennia to come. So if we look at this melting pot of various images of different Greco-Roman imagery and Christian symbolism in the earliest centuries, we will see great diversity. Sometimes there are attempts to represent Jesus using various symbols from the culture and from Greco-Roman religions. And you have partially seen that already, so I will quickly go through it. There were attempts to take over some features of Apollo and apply them to the iconography of Christ. And as a result, Jesus, following these attempts, we receive images of Jesus, something like this one, of a youthful man with a nicely done, sometimes long hair, beautifully dressed, and looking young. He never has a beard. He often has curly, golden, kind of blondish hair. And this is the influence of Apollonic imagery. You have seen this image before, Christ with the cross herding the sheep. And there is another one from Ravenna, Christ dressed as a warrior. That might be, some people say, it's also an influence of Apollonic iconography, pagan Apollonic iconography, but with, again, unmistakable Christian identity. Jesus has the halo with the cross, carrying the cross as a weapon, as a spear or a sword. He has the open book saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So the quote from the gospel clearly identifying him as Jesus Christ. And he even steps on the heads of a snake and a lion, which is an allusion to Psalm 91, that the one who dwells under the shelter of the Most High will be aided by God to fight all his enemies, and he will step on the heads of lions and dragons, or lions and snakes in various translations. And that obviously symbolizes that this warrior Jesus has conquered death with his cross, has conquered the powers of evil and triumphed, and shows us the way to go to follow him. So the elements of this Roman type and some elements of the Hellenistic types, like Apollo, contribute to the iconography, to the later traditional Byzantine iconography of Christ the Emmanuel, of the young Christ, looking as a child or as a boy. It can be from infant to a teenager, basically. There are different representations, and the theological idea behind this representation is that this child, Jesus, is the eternal Son of God incarnate. So the Word of God, the Son of God, who is before all ages, becomes human in this baby, in this child, in this young man, Jesus. And as such, he is represented on many mosaics and paintings from 5th century onwards, usually adorned with an elaborate cross-shaped halo. Again, Christ as a good shepherd flanked by two angels. There are many representations like this from Ravenna, from the mosaics. So it's not only Roman type. You see, it's also the contribution of the Hellenic types, because a Roman type has short hair, like here, but in many representations of the Emmanuel, the hair is long, like one we saw in Apollo. Again, here, and here. And a very magnificent representation of Jesus as the eternal Word of God, ruling the cosmos, the universe. So it's not the globe, because sometimes people think it's a globe, but of course there was no idea of the planet Earth as a globe in that time. The sphere represents the whole universe, the cosmos. So he is the God seated in heaven, reigning over the universe. At the same time, he is the messenger of the Father. He is the Word of God who brought the message of the Father on the scroll to earth. And he is the one who grants the crown of immortality to the martyrs. Here, the martyr is represented, and Jesus gives him a crown. The other Hellenic, kind of Greco-Roman type of representation of Jesus in the earlier times, quite different from this previous one, is Christ represented in the iconography taken from images of Zeus and images of emperors. A perfect example, so Zeus, you can see here, Zeus was always represented as very manly, kind of stern-looking, not really old man, but rather mature adult man, we would say in his 50s or so, because he is the father of gods, and he is quite a character. He can strike you with a thunderlight and thunderbolt, and he is like, well, violent, strict, and angry. So the iconography of Zeus was appropriated by Christians to demonstrate Jesus' power, Jesus' omnipotence over the world, his majesty, not necessarily anger or anything like that, but his uncompromised majesty, his strength, power, and so on. And the perfect example of this mixture of iconography of Zeus and customary representations of Roman emperors is this image from the church in Rome, from a church of Santa Prassede in Rome, Santa Prudencia church in Rome, where Jesus is represented facially similar to Zeus. He's not youthful, he's not young, he's not like tender and sweet, he's more like strong. But the position of his body, the gesture, and the whole setting of the scene is taken from traditional iconography of the emperor addressing the Senate. So there was, of course, a regular appearance of emperors in the Senate in Rome, and they held a speech there, and emperor would sit on an elaborate throne and would gesticulate as he spoke to the senators, and senators would raise their hands like that in gesture of appraisal, acclaim for the emperor. And this familiar scene was used by Christian artists to represent Jesus sitting in the gathering of the apostles, with apostles Peter and Paul closest to him, but all other apostles are also pointing their hands at Jesus, like praising him and encouraging him to say a word. So there are different Hellenic types, like Apollo, Zeus, Orpheus, which we have just seen. They contributed to another facet of iconography of Jesus, not the Emmanuel, as we have just seen before, the beardless young man, but a mature man with long hair, with beard, and usually teaching or preaching to the crowds. Jesus in this representation has long hair, beard, he is in his middle age, more magnificent, dignified, in kind of royal representations or representations of a philosopher or a teacher, which were also quite characteristic of the art in antiquity. Here we have a number of examples of Jesus represented as Zeus, only that he's holding the gospel book and has this traditional blessing gesture. And these are Peter and Paul, again, standing next to him. And Mary with Jesus holding the scroll, flanked by two angels, similar to the one we have seen an icon from Sinai, if you remember this blue one. It's a pair representation to this one, and the scholars say that she is represented similarly to the wife of Zeus in the Greco-Roman art, Hera. She was also presented in a similar position, but not holding a baby, but just as a kind of queen goddess. The shells, symbols of eternity and eternal life and wisdom, in the Greco-Roman art, again, are represented here over the heads of Jesus and Mary. Here is a representation of Jesus, again, in this kind of austere look of face, but in a gesture that recalls a rhetorician or a teacher of rhetoric, philosophy, and he's also holding a scroll. That was something the heralds often did. So if an imperial decree was issued, they would have a scroll which they would read, and the reading was accompanied by rich use of gestures. Here we have another example of Jesus as a teacher or as a philosopher, speaking to his disciples or just a crowd of disciples. Yeah. Another characteristic of this period is also that direct human representations of Jesus are often coupled with or substituted by symbolic representations. Again, this image which we just analyzed from Santa Prudencia is represents Jesus twice. Here he is seated as the emperor in the Senate of the 12 apostles, but in the upper tier, he is represented as the sign of the cross, surrounded by the signs of the symbols of 4 evangelists. But this is not just a cross, but this cross is a representation, personification of Jesus as the lamb was a representation, or the monogram of hero was a representation of Jesus. So here in this representation, we have Jesus presented twice as a human person and as a symbol of the cross. If you don't believe me, I can prove with this. I have shown you this before. This is the image of transfiguration, because Jesus here is represented as a sign of the cross, but so that you don't doubt it's Jesus, it has actually the face in the center. So it's this cross is a symbol, but with this personalistic twist, since the face is placed in the middle, but he is surrounded by Moses and Elijah on two sides, which is unmistakably identifying this event as transfiguration. And then we have the three sheep here as three apostles, Peter, James, and John, who were witnesses to the transfiguration. So there is this mixture of old representations of Jesus as a cross and personalistic direct representations of Jesus as a human person, or at least a human face. Just a couple more examples of this. Again, cross with four symbols of evangelists, or monogram of the hero held by the angels in the presence again of the four beasts, symbolizing the four gospels. But as we have seen in our overview of early Christian iconography, these representations often come together. So the symbolic one is here in the lower part, whereas the direct representation is in the upper. So again, we have Jesus represented twice in his heavenly liturgy, worshipped by the angels in heaven, represented by these four men dressed in white, and on earth, sitting on the throne as a human being with this type of face, flanked by Peter and Paul on two sides. And the face of Jesus here is, it's not Roman any longer. It's not with short hair, although it's from Roman catacombs, but it's a later 4th century painting. And he doesn't resemble here any of the Greek gods, Apollo, Zeus, or whoever. So it's a new type. It's neither Roman nor Hellenic, but it's a so-called Palestinian type, because some artists and theologians in that time thought of Jesus as actual historical person, and they said, okay, let us represent him as a man who lived in Palestine, in Israel, in the 1st century, and we kind of know how Jews look. So let's make kind of, again, conventional, stereotypical representation of an average Palestinian man or of an average Jew, and let's represent him like this in paintings. And this painting from the catacombs we have seen before is a good example of this tendency. But also this one, which is even more accurate in some almost portraitic presentations, because here it's still, it's a representation that hardly has any concrete relationship to how Jesus looked. And in this representation, we already see certain traits of, or certain traces of literary descriptions of how Jesus looked. I mentioned you before that there were Christian legends circulating around that were later written down by a great church historian Eusebius in the 4th century in his church history book called Ecclesiastical History. And those descriptions were very minimal, but what the memory they claimed to be preserving was that Jesus had long hair, long dark hair, split in the middle, kind of falling down in 2 directions, like we can see here. And it was bound on the back, so kind of, I don't know, like ponytail or something. And we will see those traits in many later icons. Also, it has a few words about beard, that Jesus' beard was split, kind of split in 2, and about color of his skin, that it was dark, as is the case with people in Palestine. Eventually, this Palestinian type of representation of Jesus develops into something like this. This is a 6th or 7th century icon from Mount Sinai, the yellowish one, representing Jesus in this kind of old-fashioned way, taken from earlier centuries as a Jew or as a Palestinian, with a blessing and with the gospel book. So it has all the canonical features of later iconography, but the presentation of Jesus is far from what we are used to. Simultaneously, in the same century, such iconography is developing. That is already a huge leap ahead from this or from this. All of a sudden, and it's not only this one icon from Sinai, but all of a sudden many icons appear that are surprisingly similar in their portraitic representation of Jesus. We had this huge chaos of Jesus being represented as whoever willed, from a Roman patrician to Zeus, Apollo, and so on. And then all of a sudden, in the mid-6th century, all the representations of Jesus become portraitically very similar, typologically similar. And of course, it's legitimate to ask why. What happened in that time that all the Christian artists started to represent Jesus with such a great similarity and commonality? And in a minute, I will address this problem. It's a very interesting problem, but allow me, since we have already come to this picture of Pantocrator, allow me to represent the main features of the Pantocrator. So here, this Palestinian type of the representation and some Hellenic features like iconography of Zeus or iconography of emperor influenced still another representation called Christ the Pantocrator. So Roman type led to the Emmanuel. Palestinian type led to the emergence of the Pantocrator, or is associated with emergence of Pantocrator. Jesus is represented as an adult man. It's a historical Jesus, the one who lived on earth. But he is not just a human being, he is incarnate Word of God, incarnate Son of God. And hence he is the teacher and the judge. He teaches with his pronounced gesture of rhetorician, which later merges with the gesture of blessing, and he holds a book which is sometimes open and is used as a teaching device, so to speak, or it's closed and sealed like here, and is represented as a providential book in which all the fates of the people are written down, and the seals will be broken and the book will be opened at the last judgment. So the image kind of brings together two things: Jesus as teacher who brings salvation, and Jesus as a judge who will examine us how we appropriated this teaching he handed over to us. For this reason, the Pantocrator icon is often placed in the dome and can have this kind of severe look that actually associates it with the iconography of Zeus in the earlier stages, or sometimes more merciful representation, more compassionate one, like in this icon. So if to summarize this development process, we should say that prior to the mid-6th century, we see a great diversity of representations. They are very different. There is no regulation issued by any church council or any church authority. Artists are free to do their best to come up with some good representations of Jesus, and they experiment widely. Those representations are idealized and stereotypical representations of a Roman or a Jew or a Greek hero or a Greek god or an emperor, and they are based on popular iconographic motifs like pagan deities, or important persons, emperors, philosophers, teachers, rhetoricians, etc. And some of them have common traits, probably based on literary descriptions of Christ's appearance, as we have seen in those catacomb paintings with Jesus with beard and long dark hair. But all of a sudden, in the mid-6th centuries, the many images of Christ become strikingly similar. They converge. I have already shown you a number of times this representation of Jesus from Sinai, but from the same, more or less from the same time, we have the mosaic representation that is built typologically according to the same pattern. Is Jesus with long hair spread in the middle, similar beard, as you can see, it has these two endings, and so on. We will see now more features that bring those images together. Some people speculate that this icon could have been based almost with anatomic precision on the Shroud of Turin. You know the Shroud of Turin probably, right? So it's like the imprint of Jesus' dead body on a huge cloth in which he was allegedly wrapped for burial. And if you apply actual Shroud of Turin, real size, and this icon, the proportions of the face, of the head and the face, are strikingly similar. They actually overlap. We will come back to the Shroud of Turin. It's all very hypothetical. We don't know how to connect the dots, but we have a number of dots, and I will first place them on the board, and then we will try to make sense of what's going on. So what we know from literary sources is that near the year 550, 545, 550, in Edessa, in one of great cities in Syria, today it's kind of in the corner between Syria, Turkey, and Iraq, in that eastern Syria, Edessa, they found an image that was believed to be the authentic contemporaneous representations of the face of Jesus, not made by human hands. What happened in Edessa is that they found in the wall, during I think an earthquake hit the city wall, and there was a crack, and they found a niche in the wall, a niche covered with a clay tablet, and behind the clay tablet there was a cloth which they took out, and they saw there is an imprint of face on that, and they immediately identified this cloth with the ancient legend which survived only in a literary form, but the cloth itself was lost. So they identified this finding with the ancient image of Jesus that was, according to this legend, imprinted by Jesus himself on a piece of linen and was sent as a gift to a king of Edessa in the 1st century. So that's a legend. We know for sure this legend existed in a written form or already in the 3rd century, and it was widely circulated, first in the Near East, because we know it in Syriac and Greek forms, and later it became universally popular in the Christendom and was translated into Latin, into Anglo-Saxon, into many languages. And so the legend tells us the following things. I will shortly recount it. So if we take this image, which is one of the multiple copies of the original linen cloth image that was found in Edessa, the story of this legend is represented here on the margins, those small images. And the story is such that King of Edessa, who lived in the same time as Jesus, got sick and was nearing his death. So he sends a messenger to ask, he hears the fame of this wandering preacher in Palestine that is healing people. So he sends an envoy who was an artist to ask Jesus to come to heal him. But if Jesus cannot come to heal him, he wants to have his image. So he asked the painter to paint the image of Jesus live and bring it to Edessa. And according to the legend, the painter tried his best, but he couldn't make the image of Jesus because, like, the real character of Jesus escaped from him. He couldn't make the image he would be happy with. And eventually Jesus was merciful to this man. He took a cloth, applied it to his face, and gave to the painter with the ready imprint of the face on the cloth. So the painter goes back to Abgar and brings this cloth to him as a gift from Jesus. And obviously, this cloth, in Greek, mandilion, that becomes a standard name for the image, mandilion. In Greek, so the mandilion works miracles, and it becomes a sacred relic in Edessa. So after Abgar's death, it's preserved in the church and so on, all the way till some enemies attack the city, and the citizens of the city hide the relic in the wall, in a secret place. So probably one or two people knew where it was hidden. They were killed during the siege or something else happened, and thus the image was lost. And it was rediscovered only around 550. And it was rediscovered in two versions, because the original cloth stayed, but since it was sealed by a clay plate, like a brick, it again imprinted itself miraculously, kind of reflected itself on the brick. So after the 550, we hear about two images. One is called mandilion and is made on the cloth and is original, coming allegedly from the 1st century. And the so-called keramion, so keramion, an imprint of the original image on the ceramic plate that sealed him in the wall, sealed it in the wall. And then in later Byzantine iconography, we have two versions of Jesus' face on a white background. That would be the original cloth. And on the dark background, that would be the keramion, the ceramic copy of it. So let me step back a little bit. That's the legend. Of course, every ancient legend has to be not taken at face value, but somehow explained. And we will try to explain. But first we analyze what we see artistically from that time. And what we are seeing is that after this chaos of early Christian art, starting in the middle of the 6th century, there appear many images that seem to be the copy from the one and the same original. You see here, and they also, those that you see survive, but probably there were many more that have been lost over centuries. So these are images scattered around the Christendom. This one is stored in San Silvestro Church in Rome. This one, with these elaborate scenes we just analyzed, comes from Genoa from the 6th century. There are similar ones, not so much this is later, but this one has stylistically similar features, and it's from the 6th century from Georgia. Georgia, obviously, the one near Armenia, not the state of Georgia. The Lateran icon of Jesus, also from 6th century. And some of them are really poorly preserved, like this from Vienna, but you still see the same shape of hair and beard. Image of Alicante in Spain. So if you put them together, they are very similar typologically. And they could be all painted copies of the same original. And you would have to ask question, why would people start painting copies of an image unless this image was really a sensational finding of something that was widely believed to be a holy relic coming down to Jesus himself. So the actual evidence we possess, all those images, kind of plays well with this legend of Abgar. The images are from mid-5th, 6th century, and the legend tells us that or not the legend, but actually the chronicle, Byzantine chronicle of that times tells us of the rediscovery of the image of Edessa in the mid-6th century. So it's logical to suppose that when this relic was rediscovered in Edessa, people from all over Christian world started to come there in pilgrimages, and we know that pilgrimage culture was very highly developed in that time. People were massively traveling to Jerusalem from all over the Christian world, so there is nothing impossible in the idea of traveling to Edessa. And as they traveled there, probably like kings and bishops and popes and so on ordered copies of those of the original original cloth image, and they were as in this way disseminated all over Christian world. Now, of course, there is another question. So this is just one of those small marginal images from this frame we have seen, showing the rediscovery of the original cloth image and the ceramion image staying there on that tower that is symbolically represented as a column. Later, so if we put all the facts or all the data from those legends together, it looks like it might be that Christian, we don't know if this element of the legend that Abgar actually received something from Jesus is accurate. It sounds a little bit too apocryphal, and it might be not accurate. But the kernel of truth that is actually present in this legend might be that Edessa, that was Christianized in the 2nd century, actually possessed some ancient cloth with an imprint of Jesus' face. And to explain this, the appearance of this image, they composed a legend that somehow tied the emergence of this image to Abgar and Jesus. But this image could have been produced by Jesus, but in a different circumstances, and we will speak about that in a minute. Then we know this image was lost, was rediscovered, and then in 944, this image was transferred to Constantinople, taken from Edessa, although it was preserved there as the most sacred relic for the city, but Byzantine emperors had this policy of bringing all the relics from all over the empire into Constantinople. And we know that it was placed in one of the churches in Constantinople and remained there till the sacking of the city by the Crusaders. And after 1204, there is no more mention about the image of Abgar anywhere in history. So either it was burned down, lost, buried somewhere, and lost till now. We don't know. But what we do know is that after 1204, the Shroud of Turin emerges on the historical scene, of which no one ever heard before. We have no documentary textual evidence from Byzantine or early Christian documents speaking of a shroud of Jesus. If it existed, it would be one of the most important relics, and of course there would be texts mentioning it. But there are none. So some scholars suppose that the image that was kept in Edessa was actually the same thing as the Shroud of Turin. It simply was folded in such a way that only the face or the upper chest and face of Jesus was visible. And we see on the actual shroud the traces of folding that would well coincide with this theory. So another thing that this Shroud of Turin, if it was the Shroud of Turin, was preserved in Edessa, also wrapped in a precious, what's the word? Like linen, fabric, precious, elaborate fabric, and it was fully covered with it. Only the face there was cut hole for the face. So when a person was looking at this image, they didn't see anything but the face, and everything rest was covered with this precious fabric. That gave an impression that this is an image of the Holy Face and nothing else. No shoulders or the rest of the body was visible due to folding and covering with this fabric. That's a theory, but it's quite plausible from what we know. The puzzles fit together pretty well. This is a traditional icon of the Mandylion. We will come to it a little later. This is the scene of the transferring the Mandylion to Constantinople and the emperor greeting the relic and taking it from the envoys from Edessa. And this is how the images of Mandylion and Keramion were presented in pre-iconoclast book illumination. So 8th century illuminated book represents the Keramion like this, and the Mandylion, the cloth, like this. And pay attention to this pattern here. It's actually a pattern of the fabric I just mentioned that was very elaborate, very expensive, and was used as a decoration for the most important relics or other settings that required like the best elaborate decoration. So only the face is visible. And we have a number of testimonies from various manuscripts and frescoes showing the same pattern around the face of Jesus. So it can be very well that this was the case, that the Shroud of Turin or some other image, miraculous image, was laid around with this special fabric so that only the face was visible. We know two images that are good candidates for the original image of Edessa. One, as I mentioned already, is the Shroud of Turin, and another, much less known, is the Veil of Monopello. Veil of Monopello, if you Google it, there is a whole website dedicated to it. Monopello is a town in Italy that a church in which has this image. And you can see that the image has typologically many traits that are very similar to those images we have seen multiplied by the painters in the 6th century. A large forehead with this little hair here, powerful brows and eyes, straight nose, and then 2 locks of hair, or 2, I don't know how to say the hair on both sides. And basically, Shroud of Turin is close to that. But the crucial difference between the Shroud of Turin and Veil of Monopello is that Shroud represents a dead man, Jesus with the closed eyes, whereas Monopello is a living person. And again, nobody knows how this image of Monopello originated. I don't know if it was researched as thoroughly as Shroud of Turin, but there was some scientific screening made on this image, and it's also unexplained how it emerged. And there is again a theory, a hypothesis that both are the burial cloth of Jesus, because in the Gospel of John, in the chapter 20, we read clearly about shroud. So when the apostles entered the empty tomb of Jesus on the resurrection morning, what they see the shroud wrapped in one place and the veil that was covering the face of Jesus separately. And since these 2 things are mentioned in the gospel, and the gospels were written very carefully, that means that early Christians did know, and the first followers of Jesus did know and did remember about these 2 pieces. They are not mentioned just like out of the blue. There must be reason. They were relics of the early church. They were objects of memory, and they might have been taken by the apostles and then handed down and down and down through the generations. And we know also from Jewish burial rites from the 1st century that the dead body was wrapped in the shroud, but the face was separately covered with a very fine linen veil, thin. And veil of Monopello is very thin and very fine, unlike the shroud, which is like rough linen. And so maybe when Jesus rose from the dead, his risen face was imprinted on the veil that was immediately covering his face. Who knows? This is just, of course, a wild guess, but as good as we can make based on the real evidence we possess. So this is the Monopello website you can check, and this is the full size, the full look of the Shroud of Turin. Jesus facing us and rear view position, because the body was placed like this and then flipped with a second half of the cloth. There is a question here. Any connection to the Oviedo cloth? I don't know. I will check. I must say I don't know much about the Oviedo cloth. And maybe that's why when John saw the face cloth folded separately, he believed. That might, yeah, that might be actually. I never thought of that, that he saw the reflection. We don't know that because the writing of the Gospels is also a mystery. It's not so simple. Monapello is probably double P. I think I copied this this website name from the web, so you have to trust it. If it doesn't work, try 1P. I don't know, but you can Google it. You will find it. So yeah, the Gospels, the writing of the Gospels are mystery. It's not that the authors of the Gospels simply wrote what they saw, everything. No, they put some signs in the text that it's obvious that they know much more than they have written, and the readers, the first readers, understood much more than what was written. They put many clues in the text that simply point to something which we don't know any longer what it was. And so since he mentions the shroud and the veil, that might have been this kind of discrete pointing to something that we lost understanding of. Yeah, there are many exact copies of the shroud. There is one here in Lviv too, and there one in California, and I'm sure with the present day polygraphic technologies they have made already probably hundreds of copies of Shroud of Turin. We have one here. It's like, I don't know, like 7 meters long or something. So what we know about the Shroud of Turin, that it was kept in Constantinople in 10th to 13th century, early 13th century. It was stored eightfold, as we can see from the folds here, 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, I don't know exactly how it's counted, but anyway, we have to trust scholars who spent years studying it. It was stored eightfold, and the exterior side was showing the imprint of the face. We also know from some records that it was exposed for general veneration every year on the Friday, Holy Friday and Saturday, so in the Holy Week before the Resurrection Day. And the custom to expose the shroud in the church, as you know, in Byzantine tradition, we expose the shroud on Friday, on the Holy Friday in the church, and it stays till the end of the day of Saturday. And that custom in Byzantine tradition comes from this original usage in Constantinople. And we have some literary descriptions that this exposition, so to speak, looked like this. So here we have the entrance to the altar. That's the altar. And behind the altar, there was placed, like vertically, the shroud and the cross with the spear and the sponge behind it. And curiously, we have some icons that developed in that time, in the 12th century. Sometimes they are entitled the King of Glory or Extreme Humiliation, showing Jesus like this or like this, holding hands like this, half-figured position, naked, with closed eyes, against the background of the cross with the instruments of torture. And if you look at this, you can see that only a person who looked at the shroud from here could have seen this semi-figure representation of Jesus against the cross. And in the Shroud of Turin, the hands of Jesus, if you see, are represented like that. So it can be actual rendering of the scene of the exposition of the shroud, hanging or standing like this vertically in the church in Constantinople. So it's an interesting archaeology of how it all developed. Well, eventually there are many images. So this, to sum up, the image of the Holy Face that was revered in Edessa and then in Constantinople and acquired a fame all over Christendom. It inspired many icons, and it became the basis for the iconography of Jesus' face in two variants, as the living Jesus with open eyes, with no sign of suffering, and as a passion Jesus. And in Byzantine iconography, it's 100% this. You will never see in any traditional Byzantine icons the suffering Jesus or Jesus with the thorn of with the crown of thorns, whereas in Western presentations, it's usually the suffering Jesus, and it's associated with the woman Veronica, who gave this cloth to Jesus on the way of the cross. It has a different interpretation. So this is the famous holy face icon in its most classical presentation. It's, as you can see, it's fully surrounded by the halo. It's imprint of the face, so there is no question of the neck or the chest. It's not the representation of Jesus' body, it's a representation of the imprint of his face. So it's surrounded completely by the cross halo. There is a question here, what that drawing from Blacherna by a Crusader knight? This slide here, it's not, there is a literary description by this knight called Robert de Clary, who was one of the knights who took over Constantinople, and he saw this and described it literally, and the drawing is a contemporary scholarly reconstruction of his literary description. And the Blacherna is the name of the church. It's actually the palace of Blacherna and the palace church of Blacherna, where this image was preserved, along with many other precious relics of Christianity. And when I showed you the Monapello, Monapello veil, I said pay attention to this little hair. You can see it on many representations of Jesus on these icons. And artistically speaking, it's not something artificially designed by an artist. It's too distinct to be made up. It must come down to certain prototype. So it's one of the possible arguments for that this iconography comes from the Monapello veil, although we don't know for sure. Just a couple more examples from Russian iconography. This is a modern one, and this is a, I think, 17th century one. Obviously, we have all kinds of artistic stylization playing their role, and many images are losing some traits and gaining other ones, and so on. Again, a contemporary icon that preserves this pattern, the same as here. A Ukrainian icon from 16th century. So, often the icons become more elaborate and they get these two angels on the sides that kind of are holding the mandilion or standing in kind of escort, venerating the image of the Lord. Here the angels are actually holding it. Okay. So now the second type, Pantocrator, I will briefly go through it because we have already seen many of those images. So what is Pantocrator? Is this representation of adult Jesus as the Savior, as the God incarnate, and the identity of Jesus is conveyed through both channels or both ways. As I mentioned, there is a portraitic face based on the holy face representations. As I showed, there is close correlation between this image and the Shroud of Turin and perhaps Manapello, who knows? And so face becomes standard from that time on, plus some cultural elements that express Jesus' identity as the Son of God and as a teacher and as a judge. So Jesus is the Word of God, hence he holds the book. In this case, it's a sealed book, very richly elaborate golden book with jewels on it, with the sign of the cross, and it's sealed for the last judgment. The colors of the dress, they are not very well visible on this particular icon, but it's always the kind of fiery red, fiery purple color of the shirt underneath, the tunica, the shirt is red, and the meaning of this red color is that it's the fire of divinity that is in the essence of Jesus. And the mantle on the top of the red tunica is always kind of blue. So the red is covered with the blue. This fire of divinity is covered with body. Jesus is the God dressed in human body, in human nature. And body is blue because blue color is cold. It symbolizes, as opposed to the fire, the red, it symbolizes this kind of inertia of body, that it needs to be moved by the spirit. It's not self-sustainable. So incarnation is shown by the play of this symbolism of these two colors of the dress. The tunica of Jesus, the shirt of Jesus, is purple with the golden clavium, with this golden strip here on the shoulder. And this golden clavia, we have seen them already in the catacombs. They symbolize the festive dress of a wealthy person. So it's an imperial, royal dignity of Jesus, especially the purple color. It was reserved for the emperor and the members of imperial family. In Byzantine texts, the members of imperial family are called metaphorically born into the purple, porphyrogenetoi. So born into purple color. So they have the privilege of wearing the purple. unlike simple people. There is this gesture of blessing and the cross halo, always. The cross halo has its own interesting history. At the beginning, it was simply halo, and halo is a very old symbol. It's present not only in Christianity, it was present in Greco-Roman religion, in Buddhism, and so on. And it's an anthropological symbol showing holiness of a person. So this kind of shining of divinity, shining of divine grace from a person. So many people were marked with halos, like heroes, gods, emperors, and saints, holy men, and so on. So Jesus' halo doesn't mean necessarily divinity in earlier representations, but halo is often paired with the sign of the cross, as we see in these images you have seen before. Here is halo and cross, and again Jesus with simple halo and the cross on the top. Also, we have seen that Jesus is often marked with this monogram, hero. So the X letter resembles the cross, and if it's placed above the head of Jesus or behind the head of Jesus, it starts to resemble the cross-shaped halo we see later. Also, in some nativity images, like this Santa Maria Maggiore here, we see Jesus held by Mary with an irregular halo, like with angel. But on the top of Jesus' halo, there is a sign of cross, a small red cross, if you see it here, whereas angel doesn't have that. So it was then only logical for this cross to come down and be merged with the halo. And as the result, again, you see the cross here. Now it's not above the halo, it's in the halo. And in later presentations, it simply becomes a part of the halo. Like, well, in this Pantocrator icon, it's not well preserved, but if you look well, you can see there are lines of the cross halo. Again, the same, you can see colors real well here. So it's the purple shirt, this fiery reddish color, and the blue mantle. The gesture of a teacher or a blessing gesture pointing to the gospel, and the gospel, the sealed gospel book. Often the icons of the Pantocrator have inscriptions on them, not only the name Jesus Christos, but actually O Pantokrator. O is an article in Greek, so Pantokrator, the Almighty or the sustainer of all, the supporter of all. The face of Jesus on the Pantocrator icons is usually it's kind of standard. It has the standard features, but also it's very powerful means of conveying religious feelings and certain spiritual depth. And I think Pantocrator icons are the best, by far the best personalistic representations of Jesus. For some reason, I don't know exactly why, but it's actually the icons of the Pantocrator that are most common and best well developed in terms of personalistic representation. Even the icons of the Holy Face are not so elaborate in that. Just to show you an example that sometimes the book can be open And there are different texts placed there. As we have seen already from Ravina mosaics, there can be like, I am the way and the truth and the light, or some texts that have to do with the following of Jesus, like follow me, the one who follows me will not wander in darkness, but walk in the light, and so on. And some texts have to do with judgment. Don't judge others, looking at their faces, because as you judge others, you will be judged. And many others. So there is this imitation of Jesus theme, following Jesus, and the judgment theme. And the judgment theme is reinforced by the sealed book motive, the seals that will be broken at the last judgment. Sometimes the inscription, like in this case, it says phos kezoi, light and life. So Jesus could be assigned different metaphors, different titles. The giver of life sometimes. So the gestures and icons can be very different. Sometimes they are pointing to the book. Sometimes they are blessing addressed to the beholders of the icon. As I said, Pantocrator icons can be half-figured, can be full-figured, can be standing, can be sitting on the throne, like in this case. With the throne, there is always a footstool on which the feet are placed, and the open book. The other thing I have to mention is that at some point in the, I think from 12th century onwards, something about that, it's not clear, but certainly in the second millennium, there appear letters on the halo. In the earlier halos, we see only patterns here. They are like stars or something, like kind of cross star symbolism. But in the second millennium, it's letters, it's like English O, then it's like English W, which is a Greek omega, and N, like English N, like Nick. And it's a Greek word, on, which means, which is the Old Testament name for God, Yahweh, the one that truly is, the very being. So it's identifying Jesus with the Old Testament God that appeared to Abraham, Moses, to Israel on Sinai, and so on. It's often believed in popular religiosity today that the Old Testament is about God the Father. But actually in all early Christian texts, starting from the 2nd century onwards, Christian church fathers and then Christian iconography believed that the one who spoke to the righteous men in the Old Testament, to Abraham, Moses, prophets, was actually the Son of God, the Logos, not the Father himself. The Father always speaks through and does everything, acts and speaks through the Son, through whom all things were made. as we say in the creed. It's not the Father alone or directly that is creating the world. It's the Logos, through the Logos of God, through the Word of God, through the Son of God, that the world is created. And the same thing with the revelation. It's not the Father himself that comes into contact with human beings, but the mediator of the Father, the Son. Again, full standing figure of the Pantocrator, which has the same motives, the same elements and attributes, but just full figured. Since he's standing on this footstool, it's still a kind of a reference to the throne. We saw this footstool here, and in every Pantocrator icon, the feet are placed on the special stool, and here it's kind of symbolizing the throne, but the painter wanted him not to be seated but to stand, so he left on no chair but only this little stool. Again, the open book saying, I am the light of the world, whoever follows me will not stumble in the darkness. Often the Pantocrator icons can be used either in the iconostasis on the right of the royal doors, or in the dome. There are many examples of the Pantocrators placed in the dome of churches, like overlooking the nave from above. Sometimes even these icons of Pantocrator can be made as mosaic, also in the dome, often as frescoes. There are various ways of representations. Well, that would be it. Maybe you have questions. I will let me stop the screen share, and I will allow you to unmute yourself if you have a question. So please do so and ask. Well, yeah. Yes.
So I know you went over and you did details of the Pantocrator and stuff. Isn't it, and I didn't quite get all the dates, but isn't the one that's in Sinai considered one of the oldest or the original of the Pantocrator?
Well, not the original, but one of the oldest examples. There is no one original.
Okay.
It's a type of an image that evolved gradually, and there are many different stages of its development, but the Sinai one is the most prominent and one of the earliest and the best artistically.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Anyone else?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Those images from the 6th century that we saw earlier on from all the various churches, how are those dated? The ones that showed the similarities?
The young Jesus, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, they are all from Ravenna, and it's pretty well documented and well researched. So we know for the fact that Ravenna was the capital of the empire, or one of the capitals of the empire in that time. And because of that, it was well sponsored with money to build new churches and some other important ecclesiastical buildings, and they were decorated with mosaics. So I think we possess literary and archaeological evidence that allows us to date them with a lot of precision.
Thank you.
Sure. While maybe someone else is preparing a question, I will say that I suggest to make the next and the final meeting on Wednesday. Same time as always, but Wednesday. Would that work for you? Well, whoever can join, please, Wednesday, usual time, probably will last the same kind of 2-hour time period. And I will try to represent briefly the iconography of Emmanuel and Christ in glory, and also escort you through a couple of most important types of iconography of Mary. And then if we still have time, I would say maybe 15-20 minutes, I would like to tell you a few words about our School of Iconography, what we are doing, to show you the technique in which we are working, because I think we haven't mentioned really in depth anything of the traditional iconographic painting technique, and I will just introduce you briefly to the tempera painting, how it is done, and what is the philosophy of modern iconography based on the traditional examples. Another thing is kind of delicate, and I think I don't want to